Hey YouTubers, welcome to my channel, Andrea RENE Abroad, where I talk about Peace Corps travel and working abroad. My name is Andrea and I am a former Peace Corps volunteer who served in Nicaragua from August of 2016 to April of 2018. In today's video, I wanted to share with you all what were the top 10 books that I read during my time as a Peace Corps volunteer. But I also wanted to talk a little bit about why I read and when I read, and also how I got access to books during Peace Corps. Now, as many of you know, when you are a Peace Corps volunteer, you will have a lot of downtime because the time that you used to spend with friends and family generally will now be spent by yourself, especially if you are not dating anyone during site or if you have a living situation where you don't necessarily have a host family that you spend a ton of time with. My living situation during Peace Corps was a sort of landlord slash host family situation. My host family rented out the front room in their house to me, and I had my own kitchen, bathroom, all of this taken care of. So I had basically my own casita, my own little house during my service, and thus did end up spending a lot of my downtime by myself. When did I read besides just at home? I also read when I was doing laundry and when I was commuting different places. Depending on your place of service, you might end up having to wash your laundry by hand like I did. I did all of my laundry by hand for my 2 years of service. That took up a lot of time each week. I would say between 4 and 6 hours a week I spent washing laundry, whether that was actually scrubbing or hanging up my clothes or folding my clothes and putting them away. I dedicated a ton of time to laundry, and had I not had access to the audiobooks that I had access to, I think I would have been going crazy with the amount of laundry that I had. Also, I would listen to audiobooks whenever I was walking places or on the bus. I would have liked to have integrated into my community completely at a level where I didn't feel like I had the need to listen, to have earbuds in my ears whenever I was going places, but unfortunately the amount of street harassment in Nicaragua is extremely high. Basically, that was a way for me to not hear all of the cat calls, because even though I had headphones in, they would still cat call at me. So that was kind of a way that, you know, the catcalling was happening, but at least I wasn't hearing it. And then I spent a significant amount of time riding the city buses in Esteli. I was in the third largest city in Nicaragua during my service, so we had an urban bus system. I spent about 3 hours a week on the urban buses commuting to one of the high schools that I was working at. That was a little bit farther away. I couldn't walk there. And then I went to a lot of cities in Nicaragua in general during my service, whether that was to Managua, which is the capital of Nicaragua, for different Peace Corps trainings, or just going to the office itself. Also visiting my friends who were volunteers, visiting my host family from training. I spent a significant amount of time on the buses during service as well. And then after all of this, I also spent a lot of time just reading. Every single night I would read before I went to bed. Reading took up a lot of my service. I would say that that was one of the #1 ways that I spent my downtime during my service was with books. I did mention audiobooks, and I did read actual physical books as well during my service. So how did I get access to those books? So I got access to books a few different ways, and these ways are different ways that you also can get access to books during your service. The first option is to, of course, bring your own books from home. Now, you want to be careful with this because you are limited to 2 suitcases, 50 pounds each, and a carry-on item for Peace Corps service. Obviously, physical books will weigh a lot, so you will be definitely limited to the number of books that you can put into your suitcase. This is my least recommended method of books during Peace Corps service. I actually recommend that you don't bring any books, physical hard copy books, with you during service. Now, if you have a Kindle or an iPad or some sort of tablet that you can read books on, then I absolutely recommend that you bring with you that to service. Actually, during Peace Corps service, when I first entered, I was very anti-ebook. I studied literature in university and I'm a language arts teacher in the United States, so I just felt like the actual hard copy was really important, and I was really anti-ebook. But once I was in Nicaragua, I actually missed having my iPad, and so when I went back home for Christmas, I actually brought my iPad with me back to Nicaragua to be able to read ebooks on my iPad. Even if some of you are anti-ebook, anti-Kindle, I really recommend that you reconsider this so that you don't have the same issue that I did. I would say if you're gonna bring any books, physical books with you to Peace Corps, reconsider this and consider bringing a Kindle or iPad or tablet instead to read ebooks on. The second way to get access to books during service is to use the Peace Corps library that I'm pretty sure that almost every single Peace Corps country has one of these. And this is just a library that is in the main office of your Peace Corps site. In my case, it was in the capital. It was in Managua, which was 2.5 hours away from my site. And this was an amazing resource because basically all the volunteers who had served before me many years ago in Nicaragua, they would all leave their books that they had brought to service with them in this Peace Corps library. So I would go to the office and, you know, there's no due date at this particular library, but there's also like no concern that people won't bring them back, because people always bring them back because you don't want to take them with you in your luggage when you go back home at the end of your service. Every time I was in Managua, I would go to this library, look around, see what books there were, and then I would pick up about 3 to 5 books, and a lot of volunteers would do this. Definitely find out if your country of service has a Peace Corps library before you leave. If you're already bringing a Kindle with you and you're kind of missing physical books, this will more than make up for it. Like, seriously, you don't need to bring any hard books of your own. The third way to get access to books during your service is from other volunteers. This could be books that people have gotten from the Peace Corps office. A lot of us volunteers in Nicaragua, we would talk about different books with one another, at least with my friends we did. And then there were definitely like hot books from the Peace Corps library that were always checked out by at least one volunteer, and we would kind of find out, oh, who has this book? I want to get that book next. And then you would ask for the volunteer to give it to you next. And you know, there were definitely certain books that were never actually in the Peace Corps library. They were just constantly being traded between volunteers. So that was always really fun, and then you would get to talk about them with your fellow volunteers, and it was just a really fun way. The fourth way to get access to books during service is audiobooks. I mentioned this before. Now, I'm not talking about Audible. Don't use Audible because you have to pay for it. What you should do instead is, before you leave for service, go to your local library at whatever state and county you live in the United States, and ask them if they have an application for audiobooks. Formerly, my library in Portland, Oregon, so Multnomah County Library, used an app called Overdrive. Your library might use Overdrive. I shared this application with a few of my site mates, and they were all able to get Overdrive for their own libraries. And then later, my library switched to a different application for audiobooks and ebooks called Libby. Your library might use one of these applications, they might use a different one, but definitely go to your library before you leave for service and ask your librarian if there is a phone application for ebooks and audiobooks. If they do have one, you will also be able to connect this to your Kindle so that you are able to check out books from your library on your Kindle while you are abroad. You know, you don't make very much money at all when you're a Peace Corps volunteer. Do not spend your money on Audible or Kindle or anything like this. You should be using your library. Also, you have to pay state and federal taxes while you are a Peace Corps volunteer. So I don't know, the way I saw it was having access to my library back home was literally like the only benefit I was receiving from paying state taxes while I was a Peace Corps volunteer. You're still gonna have to pay taxes as a Peace Corps volunteer. You might as well be reaping one of the benefits. After you have access to the audiobook and ebook application, it's just really easy to scroll through and find different books. Now let's talk about the books that I read during my Peace Corps service. So originally, when I first joined the Peace Corps, I really wanted to read 100 books during my service. This is something that a lot of return Peace Corps volunteers have done. You can find blogs about it, about people who have read 100 books during their service, and I really wanted to do this. But unfortunately, as many of you know, I was evacuated and my service was cut short when all Peace Corps Nicaragua was evacuated and the program was shut down. I was evacuated in April of 2018, and originally my service was supposed to go until November of 2018. But I did still read 71 books during my service. So I think if I had been able to fulfill my service all the way until November, I think I would have definitely been able to make it to 100 since I'd already made it to 71 books at that point in my service. I won't talk about all the books that I read during my service, but I have included a complete list of the books, of the 71 books that I read during my service in the description box below. So definitely expand that description box so you can check out all the books that I read during my service. But I do want to talk about the top 10 books that I read during my service that really impacted me in one way or another. These books are in no particular order, but they're just books that really touched me during my service. So the first is Wild by Cheryl Strayed, who actually lives in the same neighborhood as I do back in the United States. But anyways, it's about her story of hiking the Pacific Crest Trail after just a whole bunch of stuff goes on in her life. Her mom passes away, she's dealing with drug issues, and then she escapes to hike the Pacific Crest Trail. Being that I was a woman by myself during Peace Corps, you know, trying to discover myself, this book really spoke to me. Similarly, Eat, Pray, Love by Elizabeth Gilbert also really spoke to me during my service. That was the first time I'd ever read Eat, Pray, Love. I know it's a very popular book. If you haven't read this book, I highly recommend that you read it during your service because, again, it's the story of a woman leaving the past behind her, trying to move forward, trying to grow from her experience abroad, just so much as I felt like I was during my Peace Corps service. Highly recommend those two books, Wild and Eat, Pray, Love. The next book that I want to recommend to you all, you probably didn't even realize that it was a book. Orange is the New Black. You probably know about the TV show. It is based on a memoir, the true story of a woman who was in a women's prison for 1 year. Piper is the author's name, which is the name of the main character in the show. It was just really interesting because I felt like I could relate to her so much. I know that sounds really bizarre, but I felt like there were certain similarities between an incarcerated woman and a Peace Corps volunteer. I know that sounds really morbid, but there were just certain things where she often talked about feeling like she had no control of her life, that she had to, you know, wear this uniform, that she was always looking for, oh, how can I still like be feminine in this uniform? Restrictions on what she could eat. You know, she was limited to what she had available to her in the prison, dealing with different, you know, prison politics and different women in the prison, just like the different inherent drama that comes up with being limited and having access to only a few other humans. I felt like there were so many things that I could relate to as a Peace Corps volunteer, you know, feeling like I couldn't dress the way I wanted to because I would be catcalled, you know, trying to still feel pretty, you know, when I was wearing clothing that I would never wear in the United States, being limited to the food that I had access to there, dealing with, you know, having access to a limited number of Americans and having to build relationships just with the people that I was limited to. I'm not sure if that makes sense. I hope I'm explaining myself well, but seriously, like, especially if you're watching this and you're currently in Peace Corps, read Orange is the New Black. Like, you will see what I mean. It's weird how much I was able to relate to that book as a Peace Corps volunteer. Next book that I really enjoyed during my service is Blood of Brothers by Stephen Kinzer. Now, this is a book having to do specifically with the revolution in Nicaragua, and I recommend to all of you that you find out which books have to do with the country that you are serving in. Blood of Brothers was by far the best book that I found on Nicaragua and the history of Nicaragua. Definitely look into what sort of books are written about your country of service. There also are a whole bunch of Peace Corps memoirs written by Peace Corps volunteers, so definitely look into those as well. But for me, as far as Peace Corps Nicaragua goes, Blood of Brothers was the best one that I read. The next book that I recommend that is in my top 10 is The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. This is easily one of the best books I've ever read in my entire life. If it is not already on its way to being a classic, I am pretty sure that 100 years from now, 200 years from now, The Goldfinch will still be considered an incredible story. It did win the Pulitzer Prize for literature. So yeah, just an amazing book. I won't go more into detail than that. The next book that I loved during my Peace Corps service was Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. It's a really fat book, but believe me, you have more than enough time to read fat classics during your Peace Corps service. I was really struck by this book because it talked about poverty, and it talks about how the cycle of poverty never really ends, and how even if you were fine at one point in your life and you were economically okay, that even you are susceptible to falling into the throes of poverty. So I don't know, I think it had something to do with being in a developing country, but also being from a country, the United States, that deals with poverty. We have more children in the United States living below the poverty line than any other developed country in the world. We have an extremely crazy homeless problem in the United States. So I just felt like this book was able to connect. I was able to connect to this book in so many different ways. The next book that I recommend is Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. And again, another fat classic, but again, you have more than enough time to read it. I was really struck by this book because, well, the opening line is so famous, right? It says, all happy families are the same, but all unhappy families are different in their own way. Something like this. But I was actually struck by this book because I felt like, even though it's an old book, his description of adultery and just the process of what happens after like a spouse or a partner, girlfriend, boyfriend, cheats on their partner, the process of how the relationship breaks down, I felt like it was still so relevant to today. His accuracy at describing a relationship that is falling apart was like spot on. It was really, really good. The next book that I absolutely loved during my service actually is the one that inspired me to start this YouTube channel, which is another Elizabeth Gilbert book, Big Magic. And in this book, she talks about how she believes that the universe is full of ideas and that the universe selects different humans, individuals on this planet to carry out ideas that need to be manifested. I remember when I first thought about creating a YouTube channel about Peace Corps and about my experience of being a Peace Corps volunteer, I never before had considered having a YouTube channel. That was never something that had ever crossed my mind before. But then it suddenly came to me and I was like, wow, there are so many people who are interested in joining the Peace Corps. There's really nothing that exists, other than combing through all of the Peace Corps website to provide prospective Peace Corps volunteers with information. So I thought, well, I think I'm gonna make this YouTube channel. So it was that book that inspired me to create this channel, so I had to include it on my list. The final two are actually series. I read the Dan Brown, Professor Langdon books during my Peace Corps service. The ones that are the Da Vinci Code, Inferno, The Lost Symbol, all of these books I read during my service and I absolutely loved them. And then I also read the Millennium trilogy by Stieg Larsson, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, that original trilogy that was published posthumously by the author's wife. Now, since my service, I did read Dan Brown's Origin, and I also read the two other books in the Millennium Elizabeth Salinger series that were published by a different Swedish author, and those were good as well, but definitely not as good as their original trilogy. That was really hard for me to pick 10 books, but I did it sort of. I know two of them were a series. But those were the best books that I read during my service. If you're interested in checking out these books, I've included links to each of the top 10 below. Of course, I'm biased because I'm an utter bookworm, but I absolutely love books, and I think it's a great way to fill your spare time during your Peace Corps service. If you haven't checked me out on Instagram, WordPress, and Facebook, I would love for you to do so, as I post weekly blog posts and daily photos on my Instagram. All right, folks, I'll see you all next week.